The classroom fell deadly silent as Marcus Johnson's massive hand wrapped around Professor Adanna Okafor's throat. The 62-year-old woman's glasses fell to the floor with a sharp crack, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. 23 students sat paralyzed in their seats, watching in absolute horror as the 6'3" football player lifted the elderly black lecturer off her feet, her worn brown shoes dangling inches above the ground. "You think you can fail me, old woman?" Marcus snarled, his face twisted with rage. "Do you know who I am? Do you know what my father can do to you?" Professor Okafor's weathered hands hung at her sides, seemingly helpless. Her eyes, those calm, deep brown eyes that had seen more than anyone in that room could imagine, locked onto Marcus's face without a trace of fear. That should have been his first warning. What Marcus Johnson didn't know was that the frail-looking woman whose life he held in his hands had once been known by a very different name. In the deserts of North Africa, in the jungles of West Africa, and in classified operations that would never see the light of day, she had been called the Iron Dove. For 28 years, Master Sergeant Adanna Okafor had served in the Nigerian Army's Special Forces, and she had survived things that would break ordinary people. But that was a lifetime ago, or so everyone thought. "Marcus, let her go," shouted Amara, a brave student in the front row. Her voice cracked with terror. Marcus squeezed harder, his knuckles white with pressure. "Shut up. All of you, shut up. I'm sick of this. Sick of her judging me, looking down on me, treating me like I'm nothing." Professor Okafor's lips moved slightly, and though her voice was barely a whisper, every person in that room heard her words clearly. "Young man, you have made a grave mistake." What happened in the next 3 seconds would change everyone's lives forever. But to understand how it all came to this moment, how a decorated war hero ended up teaching African history at Richmond Community College, and how a privileged young man's hatred would lead to his downfall, we need to go back. Back to where this story really began, 3 months earlier, on a warm September morning when Professor Adanna Okafor first walked into classroom 204. 3 months earlier, Professor Adanna Okafor had arrived at Richmond Community College with nothing but a worn leather briefcase and a lifetime of stories she would never tell. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as she stepped out of her old Toyota Camry, smoothing down her modest navy dress. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her posture, despite her age, was perfectly straight, a remnant of decades of military discipline. The history department head, Dr. Patricia Mills, had welcomed her warmly. "We're so lucky to have someone with your credentials, Dr. Okafor. A PhD in African history from Howard University, published author, and your work with the Peace Corps. Truly impressive." Adanna had simply smiled, her official resume carefully omitting the 28 years that mattered most. No one here knew about the combat medals, the classified missions, or the lives she had saved and taken. That life was buried deep, where it belonged. Her first class that September morning had been promising. 30 students filed in, a beautiful mix of black, white, Hispanic, and Asian faces, the kind of diversity that made America's classrooms special. Most were eager, notebooks ready, eyes bright with curiosity about African history and culture. Then Marcus Johnson walked in. He was impossible to miss, star defensive end for the college football team, with shoulders that barely fit through the doorway and an attitude that filled the entire room. He wore his Letterman jacket despite the warm weather, and his expensive sneakers squeaked against the linoleum floor as he swaggered to a seat in the back row. Marcus Johnson. Adanna had called during attendance, pronouncing his name with the same respect she gave every student. "Yeah, whatever," he'd muttered, not looking up from his phone. The first few weeks passed tensely. While most students engaged enthusiastically with lessons about ancient African kingdoms, the spread of Islam, and the impact of colonization, Marcus was a constant disruption. He showed up late, talked during lectures, and made dismissive comments under his breath. "This is boring," he'd mumble during a presentation about the Mali Empire. "Why do we have to learn about old African stuff anyway?" Amara, the bright young woman who sat in the front row, had turned around sharply. "Because it's our history, Marcus. Some of us actually care about where we come from." You mean where you come from? Marcus had shot back, his voice dripping with contempt. My family's been American for generations. I'm not African. I'm American. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? Drop your country or city in the comments below. I love knowing that this story is reaching people everywhere from Lagos to London, from Atlanta to Accra. Let me know where you are. Adanna had handled that moment with quiet grace, explaining that African American history and African history were beautifully intertwined, that understanding one enriched the other. But Marcus had simply rolled his eyes and returned to his phone. The real trouble began in October, during midterm examinations. Marcus had failed spectacularly, scoring 32% on a test that required only basic comprehension of the material covered. When Adanna handed back the graded papers, Marcus's face had turned dark with rage. This is bullshit, he'd said loudly, crumpling the paper in his fist. Mr. Johnson, watch your language. Adanna had replied calmly. If you're struggling with the material, I'm happy to arrange tutoring sessions. I don't need tutoring, Marcus had snapped, standing up so violently his desk screeched across the floor. I need you to pass me. Do you know who my father is? He's donated over $1 million to this school. The classroom had gone silent. Everyone knew Marcus came from money. His father, Richard Johnson Sr., was a prominent businessman and major donor to the college. Everyone also knew that Marcus believed his family's wealth made him untouchable. Adanna had looked at him with those calm, steady eyes, the same eyes that had stared down armed militants in the Niger Delta, that had remained focused during firefights when younger soldiers panicked. Mr. Johnson, in my classroom, your father's money cannot buy you knowledge, and it certainly cannot buy you a passing grade. You earn that through work. Marcus's jaw had clenched, his hands balling into fists. You're going to regret this, old woman. Nobody disrespects me like this. He had stormed out, slamming the door so hard that a map of Africa fell off the wall. Adanna had simply picked it up, rehung it carefully, and continued her lecture as if nothing had happened. But several students, including Amara, had noticed something in that moment. The professor's hands, weathered and scarred in ways that didn't match her official story of being a simple academic and Peace Corps volunteer. Those scars told stories of their own, stories that were about to come crashing into the present. The weeks following Marcus's outburst had been filled with escalating tension. He had gone to the dean, demanding Professor Okafor be fired. His father had made angry phone calls, threatening to withdraw funding. But Dean Whitmore, a fair man who valued academic integrity, had stood firm. Your son failed because he didn't study, Mr. Johnson. We don't change grades because of donations. Marcus had returned to class even angrier, his resentment festering like an open wound. He started making comments that went beyond disrespect, comments laced with hatred and prejudice that made other students uncomfortable. Maybe if you went back to Africa, you'd remember how to teach properly, he'd said one day, loud enough for everyone to hear. Adanna had paused mid-sentence, her marker hovering over the whiteboard where she'd been writing about the Zulu kingdom. For just a moment, a single, fleeting moment, something dangerous flickered in her eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by that same patient calm. Mr. Johnson, that comment is inappropriate and racist. I'm giving you a formal warning. One more incident, and you'll be removed from this class permanently. Marcus had laughed, actually laughed, as if the very idea of consequences was absurd to him. You can't do anything to me, lady. You're just a... Careful. Adanna had interrupted, her voice suddenly sharp as a blade. Choose your next words very carefully. Something in her tone had made Marcus hesitate. For just a second, he'd seen something in this elderly professor that didn't match her appearance, something hard and dangerous, and completely unexpected. But his pride was too great, his sense of entitlement too deeply ingrained. He'd simply sneered and looked away. Amara had approached Professor Okafor after class that day. Ma'am, aren't you afraid of him? He's so much bigger than you, and his family is so powerful. What if he tries something? Adanna had smiled gently, placing a weathered hand on the young woman's shoulder. Sweet child, I have faced things far more frightening than an angry boy. But thank you for your concern. That had been 2 weeks ago. Since then, Marcus had failed another test, missed multiple assignments, and his grade had dropped to a solid F. There was no way he could pass the course now, which meant no way he could maintain his eligibility for the football team. His scholarship, his future, his carefully constructed image of success, all of it was crumbling, and in his mind, it was all Professor Okafor's fault. The final day had started normally enough. Adanna was lecturing about post-colonial Africa, discussing how nations rebuilt after gaining independence. Marcus had been particularly agitated, bouncing his leg, checking his phone every few seconds, his jaw clenched tight. "Mr. Johnson, please put your phone away," Adanna had said calmly. "Make me," Marcus had muttered. "Excuse me?" Marcus had stood up, his chair screeching backward. "I said make me, you old." He'd used a slur so vile that several students gasped. "You think you're so much better than me? You're nothing. You're just some old African woman who nobody respects." He had started walking toward the front of the classroom, his massive frame casting a shadow over the students he passed. Adanna had set down her marker and turned to face him fully, her expression unreadable. "Marcus, sit down," she'd said quietly.
"No.
I'm done listening to you. I'm done with your judgmental looks, your impossible tests, your disrespect." His voice had risen to a shout. "My father is going to have you deported. You hear me? Sent back to whatever village you crawled out of." That's when he'd charged forward and grabbed her throat. Now, suspended in that terrible moment with Marcus's hand crushing her windpipe, Adanna's mind was perfectly clear. She'd been in this position before, more times than she could count. Hostages held at gunpoint, ambushes in the dead of night, hand-to-hand combat with enemy soldiers who'd underestimated the small Nigerian woman in uniform. Every single one of them had learned the same lesson Marcus was about to learn. Never mistake composure for weakness. Her right hand moved with speed that seemed impossible for a woman her age. 3 decades of Krav Maga and military combat training exploded into action. She grabbed Marcus's wrist with a grip like iron, her thumb finding the pressure point she'd used countless times before. Marcus's eyes went wide with sudden, shocking pain. What happened next took exactly 4 seconds. Adanna twisted his wrist in a motion so precise and practiced that Marcus had no choice but to release her throat and bend forward to avoid his arm breaking. As he doubled over, she brought her knee up into his solar plexus, not hard enough to cause permanent damage, but hard enough to empty his lungs completely. While he gasped for air, she swept his legs out from under him with a move taught to her by an Israeli instructor in 1998. Marcus Johnson, all 230 pounds of him, crashed to the floor like a fallen tree. Before anyone could even process what they were seeing, Adanna had Marcus face down on the ground, his arm twisted behind his back in a control hold, her knee pressed firmly against his spine. Her other hand held his head down against the cold linoleum. She wasn't even breathing hard. The classroom erupted in chaos, students shouting, some screaming, phones coming out to record. But through it all, Adanna's voice cut through, steady and commanding, a voice that had once ordered soldiers into battle. "Someone call campus security.
Now."
Marcus struggled beneath her, trying to use his superior size and strength to throw her off. It was useless. Adanna simply adjusted her position slightly, applying pressure that made him cry out in pain. "Stop moving, young man, or I will dislocate your shoulder. I don't want to hurt you, but I will keep you restrained until help arrives." "Let me go," Marcus shouted, his voice muffled against the floor. "You're assaulting me. I'll have you arrested." Amara, phone in hand but not recording, spoke up with shaking voice. "Marcus, she's defending herself. You attacked her. We all saw it." "She's right," another student added. "You grabbed her throat, man. We all witnessed it." If you're watching this and thinking no way that really happened, hit that like button. And if you think Professor Okafor was justified in defending herself, subscribe to the channel because you won't believe how this story ends. Campus security arrived within 3 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. 2 officers burst through the door, hands on their tasers, expecting to find a student being assaulted by another student. Instead, they found an elderly professor calmly restraining a football player twice her size. "Officers, this student attacked me," Adanna said evenly. "He grabbed my throat and attempted to strangle me. These students are witnesses. I have restrained him using minimal necessary force." The security officers looked at each other in disbelief. The taller one, Officer Rodriguez, approached carefully. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm fine. Please take him into custody. I will be pressing charges." As the officers moved to take over, Adanna released Marcus and stood up, straightening her dress. Her bun had come partially loose, gray-streaked hair falling around her face. There was a red mark on her throat where Marcus had grabbed her, already beginning to bruise. But she stood tall, dignified, completely in control. Marcus was pulled to his feet, handcuffs clicking around his wrists. His face was a mixture of pain, humiliation, and dawning horror as he realized what he'd done, and what had been done to him in front of everyone. "You're going to regret this," he spat at Adanna. "My father." "Your father," Adanna interrupted, her voice cold as winter steel, "cannot save you from the consequences of your own actions. You assaulted a faculty member. You used racist language. You threatened me multiple times. And you did it all in front of witnesses with their phones out. Whatever happens next, you brought entirely upon yourself." As Officer Rodriguez led Marcus toward the door, Adanna called out one more time, "Mr. Johnson." He turned to look at her, and she held his gaze. "I truly hope you learned something from this. You have so much potential, so many advantages in life. Don't waste them on hatred and entitlement. Be better." Marcus said nothing, but something in his expression cracked, perhaps the first genuine emotion beyond anger that anyone had seen from him. Then he was gone, led away down the hallway as students from other classes peeked out of doorways to see what the commotion was about. The classroom remained in stunned silence until Amara finally spoke. "Professor Okafor, how did you do that? Where did you learn those moves?" Adanna picked up her fallen glasses, examining the cracked lens with a small sigh. "That's a story for another time, Ms. Williams. Right now, I need to give my statement to the police, and you all need to process what you've witnessed. Class is dismissed. We'll continue our discussion of post-colonial Africa next week." But the students didn't move. They couldn't. They had just watched their elderly professor, a woman they'd thought of as a gentle, academic grandmother figure, take down a violent attacker with the efficiency of a trained soldier. "Please, Professor," another student, Malik, spoke up. "We deserve to know. You're not just a teacher, are you?" Adanna looked at their faces. These young people who had just witnessed violence, who were shaken and confused and desperately seeking understanding. She made a decision in that moment, one she'd been avoiding for years. "No," she said quietly. "I'm not just a teacher. Before I came here, before I got my PhD, before I joined the Peace Corps, I was a soldier." The police arrived shortly after campus security, and the small classroom became a crime scene. Detective Sarah Chen, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, took statements from every student present. Each one corroborated the same story. Marcus Johnson had attacked Professor Okafor without provocation, using racial slurs and physical violence. The cell phone videos, which several students had started recording the moment Marcus began approaching the professor, left no room for doubt. "Professor Okafor," Detective Chen said after reviewing the footage, "I need to ask, where did you receive your combat training? That wasn't self-defense, class moves. That was military-grade restraint technique." Adanna had known this question was coming. She'd spent years hiding this part of herself, believing her past had no place in her present. But secrets, she'd learned long ago, had a way of revealing themselves at precisely the right or wrong moment. "I served in the Nigerian Army Special Forces for 28 years, she said simply. "I retired with the rank of Master Sergeant in 2012. My specialty was close-quarters combat and hostage rescue." The detective's eyebrows rose. "That's quite a background. Why isn't that on your faculty profile?" "Because I came here to teach history, not to relive my military service." That part of my life was over, or so I thought. Adanna touched the bruise on her throat gently. Some things, it seems, you never completely leave behind. By the time all the statements were taken and the evidence collected, it was nearly evening. Dean Whitmore had arrived, along with the college president, the football coach, and, inevitably, Richard Johnson Sr., Marcus's father. Richard Johnson was exactly what you'd expect, a tall, imposing man in an expensive suit, with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. He stormed into the administrative office where Adanna sat, giving her statement to the college's lawyer. "This is ridiculous," he bellowed. "My son is the victim here. That woman assaulted him." Dean Whitmore stood up, his face flushed with anger. "Mr. Johnson, your son grabbed Professor Okafor by the throat and attempted to strangle her in front of an entire classroom. We have video evidence. We have 23 witnesses. Your son committed assault and battery, used hate speech, and created a hostile environment. He's being expelled, and criminal charges are being filed." She broke his wrist. She defended herself. The dean shot back. And, according to the medical report, his wrist is sprained, not broken. She used remarkable restraint given the circumstances. Richard Johnson turned his fury on Adanna, who sat quietly in her chair, her hands folded in her lap. "You've destroyed my son's future. His football career, his scholarship, everything." Adanna looked up at him with those same calm eyes that had unnerved his son. "Mr. Johnson, I didn't destroy your son's future. Your son's choices did. His entitlement, his racism, his violence, those are not things I taught him. Perhaps you should ask yourself where he learned them." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Richard Johnson's face turned purple, but before he could respond, Detective Chin entered the room. "Mr. Johnson, your son is being charged with assault and battery, hate crime enhancement, and terroristic threats. Given the video evidence and witness statements, the district attorney is confident of a conviction. You should hire a lawyer." The mighty Richard Johnson seemed to deflate before their eyes. The reality was sinking in. His money, his influence, his power couldn't erase what his son had done in front of dozens of witnesses in the age of smartphones. Marcus would face real consequences for the first time in his privileged life. "Now, I want to ask you something. What would you have done in Professor Okafor's situation? If someone attacked you like that, how would you respond? And have you ever witnessed bullying or racism that made you feel powerless?" Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories matter, and I read every single comment. The weeks that followed brought massive changes to Richmond Community College. Marcus Johnson was expelled and charged with multiple crimes. He eventually pled guilty to avoid trial, receiving probation, community service, and mandatory anger management counseling. His football career was over. His scholarship was revoked. The future he'd taken for granted had evaporated in the 4 seconds it took Professor Okafor to defend herself. But something else happened too, something unexpected and beautiful. Adanna's story spread across social media. The videos of the incident went viral, but not in the way you might expect. People weren't celebrating violence. Instead, they were celebrating a woman who had survived racism, who had defended herself with dignity, and who represented strength in the face of hatred. News outlets picked up the story. Retired Nigerian Special Forces soldier defends herself against racist attack became a national headline. The college was flooded with support for Professor Okafor. Former students came forward with stories of her kindness, her dedication, her ability to make African history come alive. Donations poured in, not for the college, but specifically for a scholarship fund in Professor Okafor's name, meant to support African and African American students studying history. But perhaps the most surprising development came 3 months after the incident. Adanna received a letter, handwritten on plain notebook paper. It was from Marcus Johnson. The letter was long and rambling, full of apologies that seemed genuine and painful self-reflection. Marcus wrote about growing up privileged, about how his father's wealth had shielded him from consequences, about how he'd been taught, consciously and unconsciously, that some people were less valuable than others. He wrote about the anger management therapy he was receiving, about confronting his own prejudices, about the long, difficult journey of becoming a better person. I can't take back what I did, he wrote in shaky handwriting. I can't undo the harm I caused you and everyone who witnessed it. But I want you to know that moment changed my life. When you had me on that floor, when you could have hurt me badly but chose not to, when you told me to be better, that's when I realized I had to change. I'm trying, Professor Okafor. I'm really trying. Thank you for defending yourself. Thank you for not giving up on the idea that I could be better, even when I had given up on myself. Adanna read the letter 3 times, sitting in her small apartment with a cup of tea growing cold beside her. She thought about all the young soldiers she'd trained in Nigeria, some of whom had started out angry and lost like Marcus. She thought about the second chances she'd been given in her own life, the mentors who had believed in her when she was just a poor girl from a small village who dreamed of serving her country. She picked up a pen and wrote back. Not a long letter, just a simple note telling Marcus that change was possible, that growth was painful, and that she believed in his ability to become the person he was meant to be. She ended with a quote from Nelson Mandela, "No one is born hating another person. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love." As the spring semester began, Professor Adanna Okafor returned to classroom 204. The students who had witnessed the incident had all returned too, though some had transferred to other sections, unable to face the memories. But Amara was there in the front row, as always, her notebook ready and her eyes bright. There was a new student too, a young man named Deshaun, quiet and respectful, who sat in the middle row and took careful notes. At the end of the first class, he approached Adanna's desk hesitantly. "Professor Okafor? I just wanted to say, my cousin was in your class last semester. He told me what happened, and I wanted to thank you." "Thank me? For what?" "For showing us that we don't have to accept disrespect, that we can be strong and dignified at the same time. My little sister, she's being bullied at school for being African. I showed her the news articles about you, and she said it made her feel proud of where she comes from. So, thank you." Adanna felt tears prick her eyes, something that rarely happened, even after everything she'd been through. "Tell your sister that her heritage is something to be proud of. Africa has produced warriors, queens, scholars, and leaders for thousands of years. She comes from that strength." That evening, as Adanna drove home in her old Toyota Camry, she thought about the strange path her life had taken. From a small village in Nigeria to the army, from combat zones to classrooms, from hiding her past to having it become public knowledge. She thought about Marcus Johnson and the long road of redemption ahead of him. She thought about all the young people she'd taught, all the minds she'd opened to the beauty and complexity of African history. The bruise on her throat had faded to a yellowish green and would soon disappear completely. But the lessons from that terrible day would last forever, for her students, for Marcus, for everyone who had heard the story. Sometimes strength means fighting. Sometimes it means restraint. And sometimes it means standing up and saying, simply and clearly, "I will not accept this." Professor Adanna Okafor had spent 28 years serving her country in uniform. Now she understood that she was still serving, just in a different way, one student at a time, one lesson at a time, one moment of dignity at a time. And that, she realized, was exactly where she was meant to be. If this story moved you, inspired you, or taught you something, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because there are more powerful stories coming your way. And remember, never judge someone by their appearance. You never know what battles they've fought or what strength they carry inside them. Until next time, stay strong, stay proud, and always stand up for what's right.